Hello. Right, let's talk about heating and hot water. So one of my main requirements for a home, no matter how modest the living arrangements I found myself in, was to have it be able to be warm and cosy. In fact, I wanted the ability to make it too warm. I want to be able to sit around in as few clothes as I want, put the doors open. So I'll talk about this monster here, which, by the way, I've only just lit. Once this thing it's currently warming the fire bricks that are inside of it. Once it all gets fully up to temperature, sitting this close is not advisable. I'll talk about this. I'll talk about the wood burning range in the kitchen. What else am I going to talk about? I'll talk about underfloor heating and my gravity pumped central heating system. And then I'll talk a bit more about hot water and how I heat it, and talk about heating it using the range, heating it using my immersion heater, and solar hot water as well. We'll cover all of those. And bear in mind as we go through this that the whole thing here is built on a budget of literally next to nothing, and it's all well achievable for a minimal outlay. This stove, for instance, cost me 70 quid. I mean, it was knackered, it was covered in chips, nasty enamel, but I just shot blasted that off, and there we go. One of the nice things then about building your own home is that you can design in a few things to make life easier. So if here, for instance, I made the wooden floor fall short of the door so that I can bring in a trolley load of wood, and it just comes straight in, and the trolley itself parks there, and then the wood on the fire. Easy peasy, no carrying a basket. Right, what I'm going to do is draw a diagram of my system, and then I'll show you the components of how it works. Right then, I'm going to start with the range. I know my drawing's terrible, but hopefully you'll get the idea. And the range feeds a hot water tank here, but it does so by feeding a heat exchanger inside the hot water tank. So this range is mainly wood burning, although I'm not averse to putting on a bit of smokeless fuel lasting at night in the winter months. The range I use for cooking, and it has an oven here, and it has a firebox here, and the most important thing about the range is it has a boiler on the back. Now by boiler I simply mean a steel box with two outlets, one at the top and one at the bottom, and those outlets go from the top here to the top there, and from the bottom here to the bottom there. So this loop is called the primary loop, and the important thing about it is that this water in this loop and in this heat exchanger, this small tank within the main tank, this water never comes in contact with the actual hot water that you would use. So that means the hot water can be a drinking quality, and in here you could put antifreeze, stop the thing freezing if you go away in the middle of winter and you're not lighting it, for instance. So there's complete separation between this loop and the hot water. So it's an indirect heating system. So the way this works, and this is basically how the gravity central heating that I'm about to draw in also functions, is by this water here getting hot because it's attached to this firebox. So that starts to get hot, then all this water gets hot. This water is getting warm, but it's not flowing up as some people think happens. What's actually happening is this water here, the cold water, is denser, and so it's dropping. Because this is less dense, it's expanded, it's full of energy, it's able to be pushed upwards by the falling cold water, which is more dense. So the gravity, it's not anti-gravity, it's not flowing upwards so much as being pushed upwards by all this cold water coming down this column. So it cycles round and round like that. This hot water goes up, it goes into this heat exchanger, it becomes less hot, and therefore it starts to slide down. And so that's the cycle. This hot water comes off of here, and it can go off to, say, the shower. It also goes off to the washing machine, both of the baths and the hot taps and so forth. This tank is fed from a cold water tank which is above it, and the cold water tank comes in at the bottom here, and so cold water is always coming in here and hot water comes out here. So the cold water comes in here and displaces hot out through the top and through there. So this way, even if I run out of cold water in the cold water tank, this tank is never empty, and so this is never heating an empty space, which is an important part of it. In reality, this loop here is vented, and here let's put in an expansion tank, and that'll be connected there. So the expansion tank is just like you'd have on a car cooling system. So as this lot gets hot and the water expands, it can move up into there, and as it cools down it can drop back again. You'll also have a vent pipe coming off of here just in case, and that would vent safely just in case this all does actually boil. Of course, it's called a boiler, it should never actually boil. That's probably important to note as well. So how do we get this to run a central heating system then? Well, if we imagine the radiators here and here, if you join into this primary loop another pipe, and some returns like that, the same thing is happening in this one will happen over here. So the way I work it with my one is I've got a valve here, and if I open this valve I can let this lot flow. Now what will happen is this cold water will come in, so if that's connected to that, this cold water will come in because it's denser than all this lot as well. Cold water will flow down here, through the radiators, along this return, and that will push hot water up. But if this lot's already hot, that hot water will tend to go here because of the flow. Because imagine this is dropping, this is dropping, this is going along here. It's going to flow this way. So then this hot water comes down there. Instead of it being cold, this is now hot water coming down here, and it comes into these radiators. And in my radiators it comes in at the top, works its way along, exits through the bottom. And so you can see once again there's a loop being set up with less dense hot water being forced around by dense cold water coming down the lines. Now in a modern house this is pumped, this secondary loop is pumped, and that's all well and good, but I was thinking if you set it up so that it didn't need to be pumped and then you pumped it, that would be great, because I've seen some terrible installations, because basically nowadays you can just set up any old crap, and if you put a pump on it, heat will find its way around eventually, but it's not necessarily an efficient or elegant system. Whereas this, by design, has to be elegantly set up for it to work. I should point out here, this is actually a drop. This goes downhill rather than straight. So this works really well because the tank is directly above here, above the heat source. But this also works, all of this. And the really nice thing about this is the hotter you make it, the faster it circulates. And ultimately, I've got radiators in my system, massive cast iron radiators, and I've got radiators in the system that can dissipate more heat than the heat source can produce. So these can give out more heat than the range can make, and that way the entire system, if you think about it, is perfectly safe. If I had just one little radiator, then this could overheat and this system could boil, and then it would chuck steam out through the top. But as it is, that can't happen. So no matter how hard I fire this, it just goes round faster and faster. So it's all quite neat. In here as well, in this tank, is a conventional immersion heater, which looks like a kettle element. Now, these normally run at 3000 watts, which is way more than my system could make unless I was running it directly off the generator. So what I've done is hook this up to a 110 transformer, so a 110 volt transformer, like you'd have at a building site, to take 240 voltage down to 110 voltage to run site tools. When you do that to this, instead of it being 3000 watts, it's so I think it's 700 watts it drops it down to, because you're running at a lower voltage, and that makes an excellent dump load for the solar system. So when my batteries are topped up, I can switch on the immersion heater and it just dumps 700 watts of power into that, and that brings up the temperature in this tank by about 3 degrees an hour in my system, which is a nice little bonus sort of heating in the summer months when I've got excess solar. It's also a way to just keep that hot water topped up in here. It means I don't have to run this very often in the summer. I've also super insulated this tank. I've wrapped it up in loads of insulation, and that keeps its heat for about 3 days, which is much longer than a hot water tank normally would. Again, there's posher ways of doing this, because you could have a thermal store, which is kind of what I've made, but on a bigger scale with more insulation. But in line with my policy of doing it for next to nothing, this cost me 15 quid, I think, this tank. I used the existing immersion heater. Once I extracted it and cleaned off all the scale, I think I paid £20 for the transformer. The radiators I got for almost nothing, because I restored them myself. And pretty much the only high cost was in the pipe, because to make this work you need big fat pipes, and copper pipe is expensive, and fat copper pipe is really expensive. But other than that, yeah, the whole system costs hardly anything. There's another heating system which is part of this, I guess, and that's the underfloor heating, which I'll try and show you as well. So if you imagine in this floor there's a loop. An underfloor heating is simply a loop of pipe which sits in the concrete of the floor and is hooked in, and that does have its own pump. So I'll try and show you how that works. Now, I installed the underfloor heating before I put in these radiators and this gravity system, because I didn't understand at the time how much, I didn't appreciate, I guess, how much power it would take to run the underfloor heating, because it takes about 6 hours to bring underfloor heating up to temperature. And I had no way in those days of running the pump for that long without just running the generator for 6 hours, which was just daft. So that was a fail for a long time, until recently, this spring in fact, I changed the pump in the underfloor heating to an A-rated pump, and then it suddenly became viable because I could run it off of the spare solar power, because I've got enough solar power now that even on an overcast day there's enough left sort of like to tick things over, if you like, so that things like the fridge can run. I can charge up my laptop, I can run the underfloor heating, so all this stuff you can run even at ticker, even if there's only a tenth of the normal output from the panels, because it's an overcast day, for instance. There's always a bit of capacity to do things like this. So this winter, for instance, I can run the range during the day and pump that heat into the floor, and it can come out at night. Right, hopefully that made some kind of sense. Let's have a look at it actually in situ then. So here we have the wood burning range. This is basically same as a Rayburn, or whatever you have in your country. There'll be an equivalent. This is the German version. It's not as nice to look at as a Rayburn, but in the middle of winter it keeps you warm, and that's what matters. So I can cook on here. Got the oven, and here I've got the firebox. And this of course is running off of wood from the woodland, from the coppicing that I do in the woodland. Back here you might just be able to make out the pipes that go to the primary loop. Let's have a closer look. This is the flow then, this pipe here, and this one here is the return, and then here we've got the return from the radiators, and then this big valve here is what I use to turn the radiators on and off. So there it's closed, that's hot water only, and there it's open, and that's hot water and radiators. This here then is one of the massive cast iron radiators that I have. I've got 3 of these in the system, and like I say, between all 3 of them they can dissipate more heat than the range can produce, which is quite important for a system like this. Another important quality about these radiators is that being cast iron, they take a long time to heat up and a long time to cool down. So that means when you're running something that's as variable in output as a wood burner, which I am, these act as like buffers, so that they, instead of, if these were all steel radiators for instance, they would be heating up and cooling down as fast as the wood burner was. But because they're cast iron and they take longer to do anything, it all evens out, and so you get a steady heat from them, is what I'm trying to say, rather than peaks and troughs. So in this application they work really nicely, and you might be able to see on the ends here what massive fittings go with this big fat pipe that I've got running through it. So we've got inch pipe here, and yeah, these fittings, admittedly these would be expensive if I bought them, but I found them, or I was given them, or some such. Anyway, so here you should be able to see this is the line coming down from the loft, and it drops there to one radiator, and it comes down here, and you can see how it's slightly sloping, and then it comes down to this radiator, and then the return line drops into the floor, and it goes back under this floor and then back to the range. Right, and underfloor heating, obviously I can't show you the installation because it's under the floor, but I can show you the control section. Now this is something that amazes me when I see it in people's houses. It's incredibly complicated. My dad's just had a system installed, and it's got its own room. It's just that. That's all it really is, all it needs to be as far as I can tell. It's a loop of pipe that goes in your floor, and that's it. So you can have zones, you can have a loop of pipe for each floor that you have it in. I've only got it in the kitchen here because the main living room is obviously wooden floor. So the idea of it is that I put down a concrete base, then I put insulation down, and then I put all the pipes clipped onto that insulation, and then I put a screed that so that's it's like a screed is a bit like a concrete, but you make it with rough sand instead of gravel, and you lay it as dry as you can. And a bit of a learning curve for me that was. Didn't go so well. But anyway, it's that's so the screed then will act as like a storage heater. So you've got that pipe running through it that warms it up, and when it gets warm, like with the cast iron radiators, it tends to stay warm, so it slowly heat up, slowly cool down. Right, so you won't be able to see all of the pipe work, but basically what happens is it comes up from the range, which is next to us, to this mixer here. Now the mixer is really important because if you put water that's too hot through the concrete screed, it will crack. So the water that goes through there has to be less than 50 degrees Celsius. And that's what this mixer does, is it mixes hot water and cold water, and then it delivers the mix up through here. And then this pump here, this is the new A-rated pump, and this is something minuscule like 10 or 11 watts, whereas the last one took 40 watts to run. And then it goes through here, and then it goes through the floor and then returns back through this. So one really important factor with this whole setup that I have for heating the hot water and for the central heating is it's really important to know what the temperature is in the hot water tank, and that's what this little readout here is. So again, I think this cost me a £5, something like that. It's just a little temperature gauge, and it's an indoor-outdoor temperature gauge. And so what that means is it's the outdoor bit is just a little probe that's on a long bit of wire. And what I did here is I cut a section out of the insulation on the hot water tank, and I stuck it in so it's touching the tank, and then ran that wire back and put it up here. And here you can see what I'm on about. So here it says currently we're at 52.1 Celsius. Another really important part of the hot water system is, just like there's a mixer on the underfloor heating that stops over temperature water going into the screed, there's also a mixer up, where is it, about up there somewhere, up in the loft space, that stops the hot water coming from my hot taps getting above 45 degrees, I think it is, that I set it up. And that's really important because the water in the hot water tank could be anything from room temperature, so like 20 degrees, up to like 80 degrees. And if it comes out at anything beyond like 50 degrees, it's going to scald immediately. So if you've got kids, or if you're just like me, pretty absent-minded, that's going to go wrong at some point. So it's really important to mitigate that by putting a mixer in, I think, anyway. It's just for peace of mind. The drawback is it takes longer to fill up a bath, but on the other hand it means that all the hot water taps are safe. And that's like I say, really important, because it doesn't matter then what temperature is in there. When I turn on the hot tap and give it a minute or two, it's the perfect temperature for washing my hands after I've covered them in filth, trying to rebuild one of my engines or whatever the current project is. Right, let's have a look upstairs then. Okay, I've had to abandon the tripod, so we've gone into wobbly cam mode. This is the sleeping loft, and here I've got some wardrobes, and then this one here hides the cold water tank there. I'm wrapped in the back of the cupboard, and this is about as good as we're going to get for looking at the hot water tank, but you can hopefully see there it is absolutely covered in insulation. And that's as much for the summer as it is for the winter, so that means that in the summertime, when I'm just using the water for the washing machine and for showers and not for the central heating, I still want this to be nice and warm, to stay warm, so I don't have to heat it up too often. Back down we go. So we've covered the central heating system, both of them, the hot water and how I heat the hot water using the range and using the immersion heater. There's two other options that I will one day have for heating the hot water, and they're mostly for summer use, and they're solar hot water. Now I would have installed those earlier, but once I worked out how I could run the immersion heater from the excess solar power, and I actually had some excess solar power, I found that to be good enough for most of the time. But what I'm going to do at some point is put solar hot water panels on, and I'm going to hook those up in a thermosiphon system as well. And what I intend to do is use solar hot water panels on the front of the building to pump heat into the underfloor heating that's in the kitchen during the day, and then that heat will come out during the evening. And my idea for that is, right about this time of year, autumn, and in the springtime, you often get quite sunny days and quite cold evenings, and I think that will work well for warming up the floor, slowly warming it up during the day, and then that heat will come out at night. So let's have a quick look at those panels, and I'll show you how they work. Right then, I've just dragged this out from storage where it's been for a fair old while. This is a flat panel type of solar hot water system, and it's basically just the same as your common radiator that you find inside a house, but it's in a glass box. So water comes in through one of these pipes and it comes out through another one, and so instead of it pumping in hot water and then the heat coming out through your radiator, it's the other way around. This radiator, if you like, gets hot, and that hot water is then taken back inside and into your system. So I've got 4 of these that somebody pulled out of the skip and gave to me, and I will mount at least 2 of these, I think, on the front of the building and feed them into the underfloor heating. Right, here we are looking into the storage yard, is the wrong word, storage jungle, I guess. Right at the back there, you might be able to catch a glimpse of copper. Yeah, that's what we're after. So these are part of a kit that somebody gave me. They go this way round. These are the posher version of solar hot water. These are evacuated tubes. So there's no air inside here, it's a vacuum. And the idea of that is that the heat will come through, the heat will warm up this copper plate, which is painted black on the side that faces to the sun. You can see better on here, onto a copper tube. And there's a tube that goes inside that copper tube, and it goes up to a manifold, which is basically a group of 7, I think it is, of these tubes, all hooked together. And the liquid that's inside the tube that goes inside of this tube warms up and then is pumped around the system. And these are supposed to be much more efficient than the older style flat panel ones that I've got over there. Here then we've got the range, we've got the underfloor heating, and in between them we've got a carbon monoxide detector. Now, cavalier as I might seem to some people about safety in some aspects, when it comes to carbon monoxide, I'm right on it. So this little detector, this is a slightly posh one, it's got a readout on it, but it doesn't really need to have. As long as it works, as long as it's in date, because they do go out of date and they need replacing. I would consider it an essential if you've got a wood burner. In fact, I'd consider it an essential if you haven't. I've read a dreadful story of someone's boy being killed through carbon monoxide poisoning coming in from a neighbour's house, coming in through the wall into his bedroom. So the scary thing about carbon monoxide is that the symptoms are actually quite hard to spot. They creep up on you, because what I'm trying to say there is that when you're suffering from carbon monoxide poisoning, you feel drowsy and then you go to sleep. Now, when you've got a fire going at the end of a long day, feeling drowsy and going to sleep are pretty much what you'd expect. So it's not like when there's a fire and you smell smoke, you know something's wrong, whereas carbon monoxide can just make you feel more of what you'd normally expect to be feeling, and then you go to sleep and you don't wake up. So I'd say always fit one of these. Now, carbon monoxide is not like smoke that would rise, and it's not like propane, which is heavier than air and falls. Carbon monoxide is the same density as normal air, so that's why it's sat there next to a possible source of carbon monoxide. I've got another one. Just there. And this one here then is a carbon monoxide and smoke detector in one. So that covers most of the bases. I've got one down next to the range, and I've got one up here, which is where smoke would collect if it was coming from the big burner or from the range. So, safety is important, even if you live off-grid. So what I'm showing you here is the stack pipe coming out of the wood burning range, and you can see it comes up from the back. It makes a 45-degree turn, and then it makes a 90-degree turn and goes outside, and then there's another 90-degree turn as it goes up into the insulated pipe. Now the reason I'm showing you this is because it was a mistake. What I was trying to do was maximise the heat from the flue, but I just had a misconception of how the actual range was going to work, and it would be much better to go straight outside into an insulated flue and then up. This here, it works fine when it's going, but it's hard to get it going because I've actually cut down on the available draw of the stack pipe. So the idea of getting as much heat as possible from the flue does have some merit, and here with the big stove in the living room, I realised that idea much better. So this does actually work, this version of it. So you can see here, The stove outlet goes into a gentle sort of bend. It's still 90 degrees but much more gentle. And then it goes up in a single uninsulated pipe straight out through the ceiling. Ignore the vines, that's not supposed to be there. I'll have to cut those back in a bit. And it, despite appearances, it doesn't actually go through the wooden ceiling. There is a big gap between the pipe and the wooden ceiling, and that gap is stuffed full of rock wool, which is a good insulator for the kind of temperatures that the flue is going to see. This pipe as well is actually, it's very thick walled. It's actually, believe it or not, an offcut. It's from when I made the spiral staircase. This is what was left over. It doesn't matter so much that there's a transition point between the warm flue inside and the cold flue outside, because the smoke and the creosote is all going at a fair old pace. Also, because I'm running it hot, there's not much particulate left because it's all been consumed in the fire. So I've got one further point to make about this stove. This, well, it's a brilliant stove. It's quite old, I think probably 1970s or so. Stove design has moved on since then, and what you have now, this has got, when you close down like this, it still lets air in through the handle, so it's got one air inlet. This is a wood burning stove, so it has no grate on it. It's just got a bed of ash, and the air flows over whatever's on the bed, and then through the buffer and up the stack pipe. A modern version of this would have secondary air inlets, and that's so that it makes more of a burn. So when you're burning it slowly, if I was to burn this slowly, some of that smoke going up the chimney is potentially flammable. And to increase the efficiency of a stove, a modern stove would have secondary air inlets in order to ignite that smoke and get more of a burn, basically. So you're getting more out of your wood and less going up the chimney. Here we are in the little cabin, and I brought you up here to show you a nice example of a small multi-fuel stove. So this is a copy of a Morso squirrel. I'm pretty sure it's a copy and not an original. All the genuine Morso squirrels I've seen, well, for one, they tend to have a squirrel on the side, but also they're cast iron. This is steel. This is also an example of a stove I got really cheaply. This one I swapped for a crate of beer. And because someone had left it out in the garden for years and all the firebrick inside was completely knackered, it was all rotten, it was spongy, soft to the touch. So I just cast in some more refractory as instead of putting in firebricks, and yeah, it was good to go. Anyway, so inside the firebox of a multi-fuel you have a grate. That's the crucial difference between a multi-fuel burner and a purely wood fuel burner. So you have a grate, and then there's an ash box underneath. The reason you have a grate is because when you're burning smokeless fuels or coals, you have to have air coming through the fuel from underneath. When you're burning wood, you tend to have the air going over. And this seems to be a contentious issue, because every time I mention this, people go, oh, well, I always burn coal in my wood burner, or vice versa. Yeah, you can do all those things, that's fine, I don't care. I'm just telling you the design intention between the two different designs. So this is a really nice little stove, the Morso squirrel, or in this case a copy, and you see these an awful lot in narrowboats, and yeah, they're very popular for a good reason. They're really good stoves. This one I used to keep in. This you could shut down and it would run for about 18 hours just on one charge of wood if I wanted to put it right down to the minimum. And that's great if you get it going in the morning, you know, have breakfast, go off to work, and it's still going when you come back, which is terrific. So unlike the big wood burner down in the living room in the barn, this one does have a secondary air inlet just here. And in the case of this one, it's called an air wash. So the idea is that it brings in air from here and it makes a burn that actually goes up the glass, and that keeps the glass clean. It's filthy at the moment, but that's just filth. It will burn itself clean quite happily. So that makes it more efficient as well, because you're getting more like I said before, more for your money in effect, get more burn out of the wood. So it's worth contemplating briefly, I suppose, how wood actually burns when you're thinking about using it as a primary fuel. So wood burns in two ways. You've got the volatiles in the wood and you've got the actual wood itself burning. Now when wood is burning on its own, that's like charcoal on a barbecue. When you've burnt down the charcoal it's ready to cook on, that's just wood burning. When you see flames coming out of the wood, that's the volatiles being burnt off. So all the yellow flame that you see coming off, that's all the volatiles being driven out of the inside of the wood. And when they've gone, then you've got burning charcoal left behind. And that's one of the reasons why airflow over wood works better than airflow under wood. So if I put it in here and I have this open, because there's only a small chimney stack outside, that will help enormously for lighting the fire, for getting it going. But for it to burn properly, I would then pretty much close this off and have most of the air coming through this one and going over the wood. And that doesn't apply, like I say, with coal. You put the coal in there and you want the air going underneath it and through it. Here we are in one of my sheds then, and I just wanted to show you a possible option if you weren't lucky enough to be fined or be given or blag or whatever a decent burner and you can't afford to buy one. You could consider making one. This one I made from a gas bottle. Now I didn't really have time to go into the details of making something from a gas bottle, just to say they can be extremely dangerous and it will catch fire when you cut into it. There are ways to mitigate that, and I'm sure there's plenty of YouTube videos on how to go about it. The point I want to make is that when you're making a gas bottle burner, concentrate on the door, because you need a door that seals quite nicely, like this one does. See, what I've made was a frame, and then the door sits flat against that frame, and then I've made a latch that the harder you push down on the latch, the more it jams it shut. And then you've got an air control down here. Now this is quite important, because if you just cut out a door, you're going to have a gap all the way around it, and you're never going to get any proper control over the thing. And yeah, you need as much control as you can get on a gas bottle stove. The other thing about them is that they heat up very quickly, which can be good, but I mean they can't really hold that heat. They're not going to stay in all night generally, just because the core will cool down. It'll just burn out too fast. You could insulate it inside with refractory cement, but then you've got a tiny firebox, so probably not worth doing. You could, if I wanted it to stay warm in the night, although you can't really keep it in very well, you could stack a load of fire bricks on top and that would help. Could also, if you're making a gas bottle burner, it would be quite trivial, I think, to put a boiler into it. You could either put a boiler on top or on the back here. The boiler is just a steel box with two outlets, just as with the wood burning range. Or, if you didn't want to go that route, another viable option would be to take some copper pipe and wrap it very tightly around the flue pipe. Because the flue pipe here, this section, will get nice and warm, and you can extract some of that heat without ruining the drawer too much. So if you wrap your copper pipe very tightly around that flue pipe, and then you take it up to a heat exchanger system, just like with the wood burning range, and then back down again, it would be workable. It would be very slow to heat up, I imagine, because you're only moving heat through such a small bore pipe. But it would work. I mean, if you've got your burner going all night anyway, or all evening anyway, yeah, why not take some hot water off it? The other, and probably easiest option for hot water, is what I did with my stepsister's Rayburn, is I got a milk churn, and I cut a hole in at the bottom and I installed a tap on the bottom of the milk churn, and then the milk churn just sat on the edge of the Rayburn, and just by virtue of running the Rayburn anyway, you'd end up with a milk churn full of hot water, and then you open the tap and it goes straight into a bath, whatever, whatever you're washing up bowl, whatever you want to do with the hot water. So there's some options if you're too poor to actually just go and buy some, or too unlucky enough to be given stuff. Right. Oh, back inside, nice and warm. So that's it really. I hope there's been something of use in there, and it's really important to be cosy. I think it's one of the things that turns a shelter into a home, is the fact that it can be nice and warm like this. I also think it's one of the few things that we have in common with our furthest ancestors. I don't mean like hundreds of years ago, I mean like thousands or millennia ago. Those people would have sat in front of a fire and they would have enjoyed it just as much as I do now. And I think that's a really nice connection that we have with them. One of the few things left that we have in common with people going back that far, with the first people. So that's it really. As always, thanks for watching. I hope there was something useful there, and see you in the next one. Cheers.